In the quiet town of Briar Ridge, nothing ever seemed out of place. But behind the calm streets and friendly faces, a husband and wife were orchestrating a series of disappearances. For over a decade, no one suspected, until the pattern became impossible to ignore. This is the chilling story of Miles and Estela Harroway. The body was found at 6:17 a.m., just as the fog began to lift from the Cedar Spur rail bridge. From a distance, it looked like an accident, another tired man who had slipped, another name to be written in pencil on a sheriff's clipboard. The coroner would later say the same thing everyone else said: wrong place, wrong time. A fall, a cracked skull, no signs of struggle worth mentioning. In Briar Ridge, Iowa, accidents were comforting. They meant no one was to blame. The man's name was Calvin Rowe, age 46, seasonal laborer, divorced twice, known to drink before sunrise. His boots were still on. His wallet was in his pocket. The train conductor swore he hadn't seen anyone on the bridge when the freight thundered through at 2:12 a.m. By noon, the town had already moved on. Briar Ridge was the kind of place newspapers never mentioned unless a tornado passed through nearby counties. One main street, two churches, a rail line that cut the town clean in half, like a scar everyone pretended not to notice. People here believed in routine, in early dinners, in locking doors more out of habit than fear. The sheriff, Walter Kincaid, signed the report without rereading it. He had known Calvin Rowe for years. Men like Rowe fell all the time, off ladders, into ditches, out of favor. No mystery in that. What no one noticed was the way Rowe's right hand was clenched so tightly that his fingernails had cut into his palm, or that his watch had stopped at 1:48 a.m., 24 minutes before the train arrived. That evening, 2 miles from the bridge, a radio played softly in a modest white house on Alder Street. The announcer's voice drifted through the kitchen, calm and warm, talking about crop prices and the weather moving in from Nebraska. At the table sat Miles Harroway, 39, thin, clean-shaven, his work shirt neatly pressed even after a 10-hour shift at the rail depot. He ate slowly, methodically, chewing each bite as if it required consideration. Across from him sat Estela Harroway. She folded a dish towel with careful precision, smoothing the fabric flat before setting it aside. Her dark hair was pinned back, her expression neutral, almost serene. If not for her eyes, sharp, constantly measuring, she might have looked like any other small-town housewife. "The sheriff drove past again today," she said casually. "Third time this week." Miles nodded. "They'll be busy for a day or two." "About the man on the bridge?" "Yes." She sat down finally and reached for her coffee. "They'll call it what it is." "What is that?" Miles asked, though he already knew the answer she expected. "An accident," Estela said. "That's what this town understands." Outside, a freight train screamed through the darkness, metal on metal, shaking the windows just enough to be felt, but not enough to worry anyone. Miles waited until the sound faded before speaking again. "He shouldn't have been there." "No," Estela agreed, "he shouldn't have." They did not speak after that. There was no need. Silence had become their shared language, efficient, economical, free of doubt. By the end of the week, Calvin Rowe's name was gone from conversation. His room at the boarding house was rented to another man. His death joined a long list of things Briar Ridge preferred not to think about. And somewhere between the bridge and the quiet house on Alder Street, the line between accident and intention had already been crossed, cleanly, carefully, and without a single scream. No one in Briar Ridge remembered exactly when Miles Harroway had arrived. Some said it was in the late 40s, others swore it was after Korea. The truth was less dramatic. Miles came in 1952 with a single suitcase, a letter of recommendation from a rail supervisor in Illinois, and a name that sounded respectable enough not to invite questions. He learned the town quickly, learned which men talked too much, which women noticed too much, and which places stayed empty after dark. The rail depot suited him. Trains followed rules. Timetables mattered. Steel behaved the same way every time if you understood pressure and speed. Miles did. He was born Milosz Harrowitz in Milwaukee to Polish immigrants who believed silence was safer than honesty. His father worked until his hands failed. His mother prayed until words lost meaning. By the time Miles shortened his name, he had already learned the most important lesson of his childhood. People ignored what looked ordinary. Estela was not ordinary. She arrived in Briar Ridge years later, in 1959, driving a pale green Plymouth with Arizona plates. Her full name was Estela Marin Calderon, born in El Paso, raised between Spanish and English, Catholic guilt and American ambition. She trained as a nurse in San Antonio, where she learned how bodies failed and how easily people trusted a calm voice and clean hands. Her first husband died in childbirth. That was how the town heard it anyway. Complications, blood loss, a tragedy that left Estela childless and quiet. She never corrected anyone who assumed the baby had died too. Letting people believe something simple was often easier than explaining something true. Miles met her when he slipped on an oil-slicked platform and tore the skin along his forearm. It wasn't a serious injury, but Estela insisted on cleaning it properly at the small clinic near Main Street. She noticed how still he sat, how he never flinched, how his eyes followed her movements not with desire, but with interest. "You work with machines," she said. "Yes. They behave if you treat them right." Miles smiled at that, a small smile, almost nothing. They married 8 months later. To the town, they were unremarkable, a quiet railman and a nurse who baked well and attended church just often enough. Their house on Alder Street was neat, undecorated, free of photographs except for one wedding portrait in the hallway. No children, no pets, no loud arguments. Inside, their marriage functioned like a system. They spoke plainly to one another. They shared routines. Estela handled finances. Miles handled logistics. Neither raised their voice. Neither asked questions they already knew the answers to. The idea did not arrive all at once. It began with conversations about disorder, about people who broke things and left others to clean up the damage, men who drank and frightened children, women who lied and ruined families, people who took and never repaired what they damaged. "There are too many of them," Estela said one night, not angrily, just observant. Miles considered this. No one notices when they're gone. That was the moment. Not a pact, not a promise, just a shared understanding settling into place. Calvin Rowe fit the pattern perfectly. He drank behind the station, shouted at passing girls, broke into freight cars looking for anything small enough to sell. Miles had seen him there late at night more times than he could count. Estela knew Rowe had been treated twice for injuries he couldn't explain. "He's going to hurt someone," she said. "He already has," replied Miles. They did not discuss methods. They didn't need to. Between the two of them, rail schedules and medical knowledge, access and trust, the solution was obvious. The bridge was chosen because it belonged to no one. By the time Calvin Rowe fell, Briar Ridge had already accepted the story it wanted to believe. And for Miles and Estela Harroway, the town's silence felt less like luck and more like permission. The bridge waited quietly. It had always waited, for trains and for footsteps. Miles Harroway had checked it 3 times that evening, running a finger along the cold steel beams, counting the bolts, measuring the shadows. The fog crept in from the river, low and wet, curling around the supports like a silent witness. Calvin Rowe didn't know he was being watched. The man's habits were predictable. He drank near the rail depot, cursed at passing girls, occasionally tried to sneak into freight cars for small loot. Tonight, he was staggering along the walkway, muttering under his breath about losing his job, about being cheated, about the unfairness of the world. Miles and Estela had followed him separately, from different vantage points. She had trailed behind in the darkness, silent, her steps muffled against the gravel. Her presence was unnoticed. His scent of whiskey and sweat was sharp in the damp air. They didn't speak to each other. No words were needed. The plan had been rehearsed in their heads, like an invisible script. Miles stepped forward first. His hand brushed Calvin's shoulder lightly, almost as if to steady him. Calvin flinched, spun, and tried to push past. That was enough. Miles grabbed the man's arm firmly. 1 step, 2 steps. Careful, precise. No shouting, no struggle. Calvin's balance wavered. The fog seemed thicker, pressing around them. "Careful," whispered Estela from behind, though Calvin never heard her. Her hands were ready with the small first aid kit she had carried, not to save, but to simulate a fall if anything went wrong. Calvin stumbled. Miles tilted his body, guiding him toward the edge. The bridge railing was slippery, wet with condensation. Calvin's foot caught on a loose bolt. He teetered. And then, he fell. The sound of the body hitting the ground was muffled by distance and the river below. Miles stepped back immediately, wiping his hand on his shirt as if nothing had happened. Estela exhaled slowly, her face calm, almost serene. They turned and walked back the way they had come, disappearing into the fog. Just 2 ordinary people on Alder Street, preparing dinner as if nothing had occurred. By morning, the town called it an accident. Calvin Rowe, aged 46, fell from the bridge. No one had seen him. The sheriff made his routine report. The coroner added a line about old joints and alcohol. No one questioned it. But the Harroways did not feel triumph. They felt precision, a task completed efficiently, without drama, without witnesses, without flaw. In the following days, the town continued its routines, unknowing. Calvin Rowe became a story told at the diner, with a shake of the head and a sip of black coffee. People whispered about carelessness, the misfortune of men who drank too much. No one suspected a method. No one suspected a motive. Miles returned to the rail depot with the same quiet diligence he always carried. Tools in hand, mind focused on schedules, on bolts, on the quiet rhythm of steel and steam. Estela returned to her kitchen, polishing silverware, her hands steady, her gaze flicking once to the window, imagining the path Calvin had taken before the fall. Not out of guilt, not out of curiosity, out of understanding. They discussed nothing. There was no need. The first kill was not a topic for debate or reflection. It was simply done. Clean, logical, effective. And yet, somewhere in that small town of Briar Ridge, the seed of fear had begun to root. Not in the people, not in the law, but in the rhythm of absence, in the spaces where Calvin Rowe had once existed. Every bridge, every dark corner, every late-night shadow now held a potential story. The Harroways moved quietly through life, ordinary in every observable way. Miles whistled softly as he worked. Estela hummed while folding laundry. And in the quiet between their steps, in the spaces they didn't fill, the town remained blissfully unaware. But the first kill was only the beginning. The careful orchestration of accidents, of disappearances, of silent judgment had just begun. Estela noticed her first error not in the act, but in the thinking. The town of Briar Ridge believed in accidents, in chance, in men like Calvin Rowe simply falling. But people occasionally remembered too much. Not details of death, no one remembered death, but fragments of presence, a glance, a shadow, a hand that lingered too long. Her first warning came in the form of Lydia Carranza, a young woman who worked at the local diner. Lydia was sharp, observant, and dangerously curious. She had noticed Calvin's absence and mentioned it casually one morning over coffee. "Strange, isn't it? He always came in at dawn, never missed a day." Most would have laughed it off. Estela did not. She had been watching Lydia as she cleared the tables, her eyes lingering a moment too long on the empty chair where Calvin had sat. There was no malice, only observation, but that was enough. Miles agreed. "She talks too much," he said quietly that evening as they sat in their orderly dining room. The radio hummed in the background, playing news and soft jazz. "Not too much," Estela corrected him, her tone even, almost maternal. "Just enough to notice things that should be invisible." They spent hours analyzing her behavior, noting her patterns. She walked the same route home from the diner every night, smiled politely to strangers, and often stayed late, folding napkins and cleaning counters long after the kitchen had closed. She remembered faces, habits, small details. Dangerous. The opportunity came a week later. Lydia had walked alone down the empty sidewalk by the rail yard, humming softly, carrying her purse tightly against her side. Miles waited behind the stacks of abandoned freight crates, hands steady. Estela shadowed her from the far side of the tracks, blending into the foggy night like a phantom. Miles intercepted her first, speaking softly but firmly. "Need a hand?" She flinched but smiled, assuming it was kindness. In Briar Ridge, gestures of help were ordinary. Hands were offered to lift fallen parcels, to steady unsteady pedestrians. She did not suspect Miles' intent. Estela moved in next, her presence unnoticed until it was too late. A small vial from her coat pocket, a medicine she often carried for first aid, tipped into Lydia's drink when she paused to adjust her scarf. The woman didn't notice the faint, bitter taste, only the dizziness that crept up her spine. Lydia's collapse was quiet. She fell backward into the crates, hands flailing just enough to seem accidental. Miles steadied her with a gentle grip. No struggle, no scream. Estela knelt beside them, inspecting her pulse, murmuring softly as if comforting a child. "Just a faint," she whispered. Her voice was a lullaby, soothing the panic before it could emerge. She smiled, benign, helpful, the picture of concern. By the next morning, Lydia Carranza had disappeared. The town's police and neighbors assumed she had run off, perhaps to a relative in a nearby city. A note was never found. A bag left on the counter suggested planning. No one suspected foul play. But Miles and Estela had learned something important. Method alone was not enough. Perception had to be managed. Lydia's disappearance had to seem normal, mundane, inevitable. And it did. The town swallowed it whole. The act left a residue, though, in their minds, a thrill not from killing, but from control. The ability to erase someone entirely, not violently, not publicly, but invisibly. To pull a presence from the world and leave only a story, a rumor, a question mark. It was intoxicating. And it marked the first time their partnership truly solidified. Miles no longer questioned, Estela no longer hesitated. They were not simply husband and wife, they were collaborators in a silent system of judgment. The next target would require more precision, and as the Harroways moved through the quiet streets of Briar Ridge, they began to catalog, in private, a list of those who were too loud, too careless, or too perceptive. The town went on, sipping coffee, sweeping porches, filing reports of missing persons that never truly alarmed anyone. The Harroways were careful, ordinary, attentive, and in that carefulness, invisible.
By the end of the week, the diner hummed as usual. Plates clattered, the jukebox played, and the air smelled of coffee and frying bacon. No one remembered Lydia. No one would. Except the Harroways, who knew exactly what had happened and who smiled at the quiet perfection of their system. The first woman was gone, and with her, a lesson had been learned. The perfect crime was not only about action, but about perception, trust, and the invisible manipulation of reality itself.
The Harroways had perfected the rhythm of disappearances. Calvin Rowe had been a test. Lydia Carranza had been a rehearsal. But the next incident required boldness, a double removal of witnesses, people who could not simply vanish without attention. The target was a local couple, Franklin and Mabel Whitaker, small-time farmers who lived 2 miles outside Briar Ridge. They were ordinary in every sense, stubborn, talkative, and prone to curiosity. They had noticed Miles and Estela in town, had exchanged polite greetings, and had made casual comments about the people who came and went near the rail depot. Nothing suspicious, but their memory was sharp, and their presence inconvenient. Miles drove the old Plymouth slowly along the back roads, careful to avoid headlights. The Harroways had spent weeks studying the Whitakers, their routines, when they left the farm, when they were alone, the placement of their smokehouse and barn. By the time they reached the edge of the property, the fog was thick, suffocating, clinging to the grass and fence posts. Estela stepped first, her nurse's bag slung over her shoulder, containing syringes, small flasks, and medical implements masked as first aid supplies. Miles followed, carrying a small kerosene lantern and a set of tools that had nothing to do with medical practice, but everything to do with fire. They approached the farmhouse quietly. Inside, Franklin and Mabel were preparing dinner, unaware of the shadows stretching across the walls. The first step was diversion, a discreetly placed lantern near the back porch, a subtle ember under the hay in the barn. Miles worked with precise attention, arranging materials to mimic an accidental fire. Estela knocked lightly on the door. "Evening, neighbors," she called, soft and calm. "We thought we'd see if you needed a hand with anything." Mabel answered, smiling politely. "Thank you, Estela. We're just finishing supper." Miles stepped slightly behind her. "Quiet night for the firewood?" he asked casually, as if merely conversing. Within moments, the setup had been completed. A small chemical compound, innocuous in appearance, had been placed in the barn's hay, a slow ignition substance, harmless if handled, but capable of producing a convincing blaze. The couple went about their evening, oblivious. By the time Franklin returned from checking the chicken coop, smoke had begun to curl beneath the barn roof. Estela's face remained calm, nurturing, like a concerned neighbor. She suggested moving the animals to safety. Franklin, grateful, rushed to help, unaware that the fire had been orchestrated to start precisely when they were most vulnerable. Miles ensured the ignition was timed correctly, then retreated into the shadows. The fire spread quickly, licking the wooden beams, consuming the barn silently, with controlled ferocity. Flames reflected in the Whitakers' eyes as they fought to save what they could. It wasn't until the fire brigade arrived that the truth became apparent. Franklin and Mabel Whitaker were trapped. The structural supports had been subtly weakened over weeks, the exits misaligned, ensuring that once the blaze reached the center, escape was nearly impossible. By morning, the town mourned 2 lives lost to an accidental barn fire. Neighbors whispered about carelessness, about old wiring, about the dangers of storing hay too close to heating lamps. No one suspected arson. The sheriff noted unfortunate circumstances in his report, and life moved on. Miles and Estela returned home without a word. Dinner was served. The radio hummed in the background. Estela polished the silverware. Miles adjusted the mantel clock. Their faces were calm, their hands steady, their routine unbroken.
But the act had left an impression deeper than any previous kill. They had moved beyond individuals. They had erased a family, manipulated circumstance, and left only the illusion of accident. The thrill was methodical, not emotional, but it lingered, like the scent of smoke after a fire, subtle, pervasive, almost intoxicating. By the end of the week, Briar Ridge had already forgotten Franklin and Mabel Whitaker. Their absence was noted briefly at church and at the diner, but explanations were sufficient. Life continued, and the Harroways catalogued another successful act. Yet with this act came a faint awareness, a trace of risk. Controlling the chaos of one individual was simple. Manipulating two, ensuring no witnesses survived, required precision and patience. They would refine their methods further, they agreed silently. The small Midwestern town slept peacefully, oblivious to the invisible system of judgment that had just removed two of its residents. And the Harroways, husband and wife, sat quietly at the table, sipping coffee, already planning the next move. The fire had been a test in complexity, and it had passed. But with each step, the boundaries between accident, murder, and justice blurred further. The town remained unaware, but the Harroways knew. Briar Ridge would never truly be the same.
Briar Ridge had grown used to minor disappearances and tragic accidents, but the Harroways knew their next challenge would test their ingenuity. A man who passed through town only once a month, never leaving a trace except for rumors at the train depot. His name was Orville Hensley, a traveling salesman from Missouri. He arrived by freight train, carrying boxes of household goods and small trinkets. Orville was meticulous, polite, and curious, a combination dangerous to those who thrived on invisibility. He asked too many questions about the rail schedules, the townspeople, and inadvertently about Calvin Rowe's fall. He had spoken to Lydia Carranza before her disappearance, asking if she had noticed anything unusual. Miles had observed him for 2 weeks, noting his habits. He preferred coffee at the diner, always sat near the window and counted the train wheels as they passed. Estela studied his demeanor, his casual curiosity, the way he paused, the way his eyes lingered. Dangerous, but controllable. The plan was simple, yet required absolute precision. Orville's train would stop late at night, departing again before dawn. There was only one chance. Estela prepared the materials, a small vial containing a sedative disguised in a harmless-looking bottle of tonic water. Miles studied the depot, noting which shadows could hide them, which benches would conceal their movements. The fog was heavier that evening, rolling over the tracks like a slow tide. Orville arrived as usual, his case in hand, whistle from the departing freight echoing behind him. He greeted Miles casually. "Evening," he said, tipping his hat. "Quiet night for travel, isn't it?" Miles smiled faintly, a gesture devoid of warmth. "It is," he replied. Estela followed discreetly, her hand brushing against the tonic bottle hidden in her coat. Inside the waiting room, Orville poured himself a drink from a thermos. Estela approached with the kind of gentle concern only a nurse could muster. "You look tired. Would you like some water?" Orville accepted, oblivious to the tiny drop of sedative that slid into the liquid. He drank it quickly, thinking nothing of it. Moments later, his eyelids drooped. He slumped forward, silent, falling into a deep, unconscious sleep. Miles moved swiftly, lifting him carefully. Estela's hands guided the unconscious man with gentle skill, masking the motion as concern. They carried him to a secluded stretch near the river, where a shallow embankment ran along the bank. The water below glistened faintly under the moonlight. Estela whispered instructions to Miles, who nodded, steady and precise. Together,
They lowered Orville carefully, ensuring he would appear to have slipped while walking along the riverbank. One small push, one controlled misstep, and he tumbled silently into the water. The fog swallowed him instantly. No sound, no struggle, only the faint ripple of water disturbed by his descent. Miles and Estela stepped back, silent, composed, observing as the river reclaimed its surface. By morning, Orville Hensley's absence was noticed at the depot. Travelers asked about him, but the town had no reason to suspect foul play. A search was launched briefly along the tracks and riverbanks. A fragment of his satchel washed up days later near the bridge. An accident, they said. No one questioned further. The Harroways cataloged another success. Each disappearance refined their technique, control, invisibility, and subtlety. They had learned the power of perception and of timing. Yet with Orville, they noted something new, the thrill of risk. Unlike Calvin Rowe or Lydia Carranza, he had been observant and mobile. Erasing him required the perfect combination of patience, planning, and execution. And they had succeeded. Miles returned home, methodical as ever, polishing his tools. Estela folded the laundry, humming softly, her face serene, betraying nothing of the calculation that had just unfolded. Briar Ridge, in its sleepy normality, would speak of a missing salesman for a few weeks before forgetting him entirely. People trusted the train schedules, the fog, the accidents. They never suspected the Harroways, whose quiet, ordinary presence had become the veil over a hidden series of calculated judgments. And as the town slept, unaware, the Harroways sat at their table, silent, planning their next move. Because Orville Hensley had been a lesson. No one should escape notice, and no one should disrupt the system they had quietly imposed on Briar Ridge. The line between accident and intent was now blurred beyond recognition, and for the Harroways, that line was where their power resided.
By 1962, Briar Ridge had grown complacent. The townspeople whispered about missing neighbors, but they dismissed such occurrences as chance, misfortune, or poor judgment. The Harroways had perfected the rhythm of disappearance, controlling perception as carefully as they controlled events. Yet even the most meticulous plan could face complications, and the next threat came in the form of communication, something they had underestimated. It began with letters. A young clerk at the local post office, Harlan Booth, had a habit of reading letters while sorting them, a minor curiosity, harmless in intent. Over time, he began to notice patterns, letters to distant relatives, notes from absent family members, inquiries about missing persons, some referencing Calvin Rowe, Lydia Carranza, and Orville Hensley. The handwriting, the postmarks, the phrasing, all suggested that someone outside Briar Ridge was noticing the gaps in the town's population. Harlan spoke cautiously to his friends at the diner, speculating that the disappearances might be more than accidents. Small rumors began circulating. For the Harroways, it was subtle, indirect, but dangerous. The system they had created depended on invisibility. Attention, even from an innocent clerk, threatened that delicate balance. Estela noticed it first. She studied the pattern of letters arriving at the post office, traced the handwriting styles and destinations, and realized the scope of attention they were beginning to attract. She mentioned it quietly to Miles one evening as they washed dishes after dinner. "They're asking questions," she said softly. Her eyes, calm and observant, met his across the sink. "Not here, not aloud, but outside they're noticing.
Miles' hands paused. He had always relied on predictability, on control. Letters could not be controlled the same way as a bridge, a diner, or a barn fire. Yet he nodded, acknowledging the threat. The target was clear: Harlan Booth. The plan required subtlety. Unlike others, Harlan was cautious by nature, working within the confines of the post office and rarely venturing into the night. But Estela's nursing knowledge offered a solution, an accident that could appear entirely natural. A small dose of sedative in his evening tea at the diner would incapacitate him long enough for a staged fall down the back stairs of the post office, a routine hazard if one was clumsy. The Harroways watched Harlan for days, noting his evening habits, when he drank his tea, when he lingered after closing, when he walked home through the empty streets. Timing had to be precise. On the chosen night, Estela approached the diner while Miles observed from across the street. She poured the sedative into Harlan's tea, her face warm, concerned, entirely believable. He drank it quickly, unaware of the invisible danger settling into his system. Minutes later, he was dizzy, swaying unsteadily as he left the diner. Miles followed silently, his presence hidden by fog and shadows. Harlan reached the steps leading to the post office's side entrance. His foot caught, he slipped, and fell hard, sustaining injuries that appeared consistent with an accidental tumble. By morning, the town was informed of a tragic workplace accident. Friends and neighbors murmured about safety hazards, poor lighting, and Harlan's supposed clumsiness. No one suspected tampering. The letters stopped for a few weeks, as if the Harroways had quelled the small ripple of attention. Yet the act left a trace in their minds. Even the most ordinary observers could pose a threat. Each success was no longer just about method. It was about timing, perception, and eliminating even minor sources of scrutiny. Miles and Estela returned home that evening, silent, methodical, their calm routines untouched. Dinner was served. The radio played soft jazz. Estela folded the laundry, her eyes scanning the room with a quiet intensity, calculating, observing. Miles adjusted the mantel clock, his hands steady, precise. The Harroways had learned that even the smallest anomalies, letters, questions, curiosity, could disrupt their system. Control extended beyond action into awareness itself, and for Briar Ridge, the invisible hand of judgment tightened ever more subtly, shaping perception, silencing questions, and maintaining the appearance of normality. For the first time, the Harroways began to catalog the notion of inevitability, that no one could escape, not even by asking questions or noticing patterns. They were no longer just executing accidents, they were shaping reality itself, and the town would bend to the design they imposed. As the fog rolled across Alder Street that night, Miles and Estela sat together, quietly, sipping coffee, their hands brushing briefly. No words were exchanged. There was no celebration, no triumph, only the calm acknowledgement that their system was growing stronger, and the town remained blissfully unaware of the invisible judgment passing through its streets. And somewhere, buried under postmarks and correspondence, the seeds of fear were beginning to germinate.
The summer fair in Briar Ridge was a tradition the town could not ignore. Ferris wheels creaked under the weight of children's laughter. Carousel horses spun endlessly, and the scent of popcorn and fried dough drifted across the grounds. People came for distraction, for community, and for a sense of safety. The Harroways, however, saw the fair differently. It was a gathering of attention, of observers, of potential witnesses, perfect for their next demonstration of control. Their target was subtle: Thomas and Lillian Price, a quiet couple who operated the cotton candy stand. They were kind, polite, and most importantly, talkative, sharing stories with every visitor, remembering faces, and quietly observing the crowd. Miles and Estela had studied the Prices for weeks. Their routine was predictable: set up at dawn, prepare sugar, interact with children, and close by sunset. They carried cash in small bags, counted each coin, and left their stall tidy at night. Their attentiveness was commendable, yet dangerous. The night chosen was humid, with a thin mist rolling in from the river. Crowds had thinned by 9 o'clock, leaving only a few lingering townspeople and the sound of carnival music echoing over the field. Miles approached from the far side of the stalls, his steps silent, watching the couple pack up supplies. Estela moved through the shadows near the Ferris wheel, her hands carefully arranging the elements of their plan. The strategy was twofold: an accident in plain sight and an illusion of negligence. Miles had prepared a ladder that had been subtly weakened over the course of a week. It would collapse under weight at the right moment. Estela carried a small vial of sedative, disguised as a simple bottle of water, to calm nerves and ensure compliance. Lillian climbed the ladder to reach a high shelf of supplies, unaware of the fragility beneath her feet. Miles nudged it ever so slightly from behind, careful not to draw attention. Estela handed her water, a polite gesture of assistance. Lillian drank, and Miles's adjustment ensured the ladder tipped without resistance. The fall appeared sudden, chaotic, yet harmless at first glance. Lillian screamed as she slipped, landing awkwardly but not fatally. Miles caught her arm as she hit the ground, steadying her with precision, while Estela knelt beside her, expressing concern and smoothing her hair. The crowd of onlookers, few as they were, perceived only a small accident, a minor injury, a display of neighborly care. Thomas, startled, rushed forward, only to be distracted by Estela's calm guidance. She insisted he move supplies, creating distance between him and the scene. Miles managed the ladder's collapse and subtly ensured Thomas's foot caught on a loose support beam, causing him to stumble backward, twisting his ankle severely. By the time the ambulance arrived, the fall and minor injuries seemed consistent with accidents at a fair. The couple was rushed to the hospital, their presence removed from the town's nightly life, but the scene had been carefully staged to avoid suspicion. Everyone assumed it was simply the result of clumsiness and overwork. Miles and Estela left the fairgrounds together, walking through the mist as if returning from a casual evening stroll. The music faded behind them, blending with the whispers of townspeople discussing the minor incident. They returned to their home, silent, methodical, their routine unchanged. In the days following, Briar Ridge noted the Price's absence and assumed recovery would be swift. No one suspected intent. But Miles and Estela cataloged the event meticulously: ladder collapse, sedative timing, misdirection. Each action reinforced their growing system of control, of accident and observation. The fair had been more than a test. It was proof of their power over multiple variables simultaneously: crowds, timing, perception, and physical intervention, all intertwined in a single flawless act. And yet, even in success, there remained a tension, a reminder. As the Harroway's system expanded, so too did the potential for observation, for disruption. Each act required not only precision, but the careful manipulation of human attention.
As Briar Ridge returned to sleep, the Ferris wheel creaked under the empty night sky, and the Harroways sat together at the kitchen table, quietly sipping coffee. The town believed in accidents, but the Harroways knew. Every movement, every misstep, and every gaze could be anticipated, controlled, and corrected. Their system was growing, and with growth came an inevitable complication: the first real investigation. Briar Ridge had always trusted its law enforcement. Sheriff Hugh Carmichael was methodical, polite, and observant in the kind of way small towns appreciated. Enough to maintain order, never enough to disturb the quiet. But even the most complacent towns can notice patterns when the pattern becomes too precise. The Harroways' string of disappearances, accidents, and mishaps had gone unnoticed for years. Bridges, barns, rivers, ladders, each act carefully orchestrated, leaving the town believing in chance. Yet Sheriff Carmichael began to piece together an uncomfortable truth. The number of fatalities and disappearances was rising faster than mere accidents could explain. It started with Lydia Carranza's absence, then Calvin Rowe, Orville Hensley, Franklin and Mabel Whitaker, Harlan Booth, and the Prices. Alone, each incident was a tragic anomaly. Together, they painted a quiet pattern of disappearances concentrated around certain families, certain places, and, more importantly, observant witnesses. The sheriff began visiting the Harroways casually, observing their routines, noting their attentiveness, and testing their reactions with small inquiries about town incidents. Miles and Estela answered politely, consistently, their expressions calm, ordinary, unremarkable. But Carmichael was patient. Patterns did not reveal themselves immediately. They whispered, then shouted. One afternoon, he entered the Harroways' home under the guise of delivering forms for property inspections. His eyes lingered on the mantel, on the clock, on the arrangement of tools in the corner. He made small talk, observing the way Miles handled the utensils, the precision of Estela's movements as she folded napkins. Nothing overt, yet nothing escaped his notice. That evening, Miles and Estela returned to the pattern of cataloging. Each act of disappearance had been executed flawlessly, but the shadow of observation was growing. Carmichael's persistence was subtle but tangible, a presence in the periphery, like fog thickening around familiar streets. The investigation accelerated when a local fisherman discovered a fragment of clothing near the river, a torn sleeve, frayed at the edges, consistent with Calvin Rowe's shirt. It had been carried downstream, unnoticed, until now. The coroner examined it, confirmed a match to Rowe, and suddenly the line between accident and foul play blurred for Briar Ridge authorities. Carmichael revisited the Harroways' home the following day. This time he carried questions about the Whitakers' barn fire and Harlan Booth's accident. Miles smiled faintly. Estela's hands rested calmly on the counter. Their expressions were ordinary, polite, welcoming. Yet beneath that ordinariness, calculation and awareness radiated. They were not worried, they were prepared. Carmichael left, but the shadow had been cast. He began a formal log of each suspicious event, comparing reports, talking to neighbors, noting inconsistencies. Too many coincidental accidents, too many missing people, patterns too neat to be ignored. He reached out to the state police, and for the first time, Briar Ridge was under the scrutiny of professionals trained to notice patterns, to connect dots, to seek evidence. The Harroways observed all this with quiet fascination. Miles adjusted the mantel clock. Estela folded napkins. They moved, as always, precise, calm, and undisturbed. Yet in private, they catalogued the sheriff's actions, noting his tendencies, predicting his patterns, and preparing contingencies. The first tangible evidence would come soon. Clothing fragments, traces of chemicals, inconsistent witness statements, all would converge into a collection of proof that could no longer be ignored. Briar Ridge, once oblivious, would now become a town under investigation. And for the first time, the Harroways recognized the possibility of failure, not because of haste or miscalculation or carelessness, but because humans, persistent, patient, and methodical, could notice, document, and expose. They were not careless, but the town was beginning to close in. Miles and Estela had perfected elimination, manipulation, and invisibility, but evidence had a way of lingering. Shadows that seemed negligible could accumulate. Threads pulled too gently could eventually unravel. As night fell over Alder Street, the Harroways sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee. Outside, the fog creeped over the river and the bridge. Inside, they reviewed their catalog once more. Victims, methods, patterns. Every act had been perfect. Every precaution had been taken. And yet, they both understood the unspoken truth. Perfection could not prevent discovery forever. The sheriff was patient. Evidence was accumulating. And in the quiet house of the Harroways, a system of judgment, meticulous, invisible, and deadly, was about to face its first real challenge. The net was tightening.
The house on Alder Street had always seemed ordinary. The neat curtains, the polished silverware, the quiet hum of the radio, all spoke of an unremarkable life. But inside, Miles and Estela Harroway cataloged the consequences of their actions with clinical precision, unaware that the quiet outside was already harboring the law's scrutiny. Sheriff Carmichael had connected the threads. Clothing fragments, witness recollections, inconsistencies in reported accidents, and the pattern of disappearances pointed unerringly to a single household. State investigators had joined him, combing through records, interviewing neighbors, and, crucially, observing the Harroways under surveillance. The couple had perfected invisibility, but nothing could hide behavioral patterns that spanned years. It began on a Wednesday morning. Miles left the house to adjust a fence post behind the garden, unaware that Carmichael's men had been stationed discreetly along the perimeter. Estela moved to the kitchen, humming softly, her mind cataloging supplies and schedules. The knock at the door was soft, polite, insistent. "Sheriff Carmichael, we need to ask a few questions about recent disappearances." Estela's eyes narrowed briefly, but maintained calm. "Of course," she replied. She ushered them inside, serving coffee as if entertaining neighbors. Her hands were steady, her voice soft. The investigators observed, noted, and recorded every movement. Miles returned from the yard, tools in hand. The moment he stepped inside, the room felt smaller, more suffocating. The investigators had evidence: fibers from Calvin Row, fragments of clothing from the river, chemicals linked to sedatives, and discrepancies in Lydia Carranza's disappearance. The Harroways were cornered, though not yet aware of the full extent. Carmichael spoke slowly, deliberately. "Miles, Estela, we know what's been happening in Briar Ridge. We have evidence connecting your household to multiple deaths, disappearances, and accidents. You're under arrest for investigation into murder and conspiracy." For a moment, the Harroways exchanged glances. No fear, no panic, just calculation. Each had lived their lives anticipating surveillance, anticipating scrutiny. but the meticulous patterns they had relied upon had been traced, connected, and documented. Years of precision could not escape the shadow of patient law enforcement. Miles dropped the tools gently to the floor. "Then it seems the game is over," he said, calm. Estela's hands folded neatly in her lap. "It was never a game," she corrected, her voice quiet, deliberate. The arrest was procedural, professional, and efficient. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as officers led the couple from their home. No struggle, no theatrics, just quiet compliance. Their neighbors could not fathom the scope of what had occurred inside that ordinary house. At the station, the investigation revealed the full extent. Years of disappearances, staged accidents, and carefully manipulated events were cataloged. The sheriff's logs, combined with evidence recovered from the river, the barns, the depot, and the fairgrounds, left no doubt the Harroways were responsible for the systematic elimination of multiple townspeople over more than a decade. During the trial, the townspeople gathered outside the courthouse, whispering about the seemingly normal couple who had quietly terrorized their town. Inside, Miles and Estela sat together, their composure unbroken. They listened as witness after witness described the missing, the circumstances, and the suspicions that had finally been confirmed. Evidence was damning. Fragments of clothing, chemical traces, eyewitness accounts, and detailed surveillance logs established the couple's guilt beyond question. Even their own meticulous records, once a tool for control, were used against them. The jury deliberated briefly. In the end, the Harroways were convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder. The sentence was death by execution in accordance with the laws of the 1960s. On the morning of their execution, Miles and Estela were calm. They held hands, silent, and observed the world around them one last time. There was no defiance, no repentance, only quiet acceptance. The system they had created was perfect for a time, invisible and absolute, but human observation, patience, and persistence had finally dismantled it. As the execution was carried out, the town of Briar Ridge exhaled collectively. Ordinary life would resume. Bridges would be crossed safely. Barns would be rebuilt. Letters delivered without fear. And fairs celebrated without tragedy. Yet the memory of the Harroways lingered, a cautionary tale of precision, invisibility, and the darkness that can hide behind calm, ordinary appearances. Miles and Estela Harroway were gone, but in the shadows of Briar Ridge, their legacy remained, a reminder that even in the most serene towns, order can mask horror, and the ordinary can conceal the most extraordinary malevolence. The river continued to flow. The fog rolled in from the hills, and life went on as if the Harroways had never existed. Yet somewhere, in the quiet corners of memory, the town would always recall the feeling, the meticulous calm, the perfect disappearance, the invisible system of judgment that had once moved silently through their streets.